on the edge of madness. The heat was unbearable. It pressed down on me like a lead blanket, sinking into my bones, fusing with the exhaustion that had become my second skin. The sun above the island of Peleliu wasn't just hot. It was a cruel, white-hot furnace, baking the earth and everything on it, warping reality itself. My tongue was thick, dry as old leather, my throat a pit of fire. Water. I needed water. But the canteen on my belt was empty. It had been empty for what felt like years. The Japanese didn't need bullets to kill us. They just needed time. Time for the sun to suck the moisture from our bodies, for exhaustion to creep into our bones, for our minds to unravel one thread at a time. It had been days, weeks. I had lost count of fighting, of seeing friends torn apart by machine gun fire, shredded by mortars, evaporated by artillery shells that left behind only a mist of red. The enemy didn't fight like we did. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They burrowed into the earth like termites, tunnels twisting under our feet, hidden trapdoors opening in the middle of the night, death emerging with the glint of a bayonet. I gripped my .30 caliber machine gun. My fingers locked around a metal, knuckles cracked and bleeding from the salt and heat. The gun was my lifeline, my only friend in this nightmare. I had given it a name once, something stupid, something meant to keep me sane. Now it was just a weapon. Just another piece of steel and death, like everything else on this godforsaken island. The jungle around me was silent, too silent. No birds, no insects, just the distant crack of rifle fire, the occasional echo of an explosion miles away. The ground was a graveyard of bones and rusting helmets, the scent of decay mixing with the thick, humid air. I saw things in the trees, shapes that weren't there, eyes blinking in the darkness, faces grinning from the undergrowth. I knew they weren't real. At least, I thought I did. A few feet ahead, a figure crouched behind a fallen tree. One of ours, skin like burnt leather, uniform stained with sweat, dirt, and blood. Collins. He turned his head slightly, and I could see the whites of his eyes wide, darting. He saw them too. The things in the jungle, the ghosts whispering in the leaves. He didn't blink as he whispered, "They're coming." My pulse thudded in my ears. I turned my gaze forward, scanning the tangled mess of vines and shattered palm trees. Nothing moved, but that didn't mean they weren't there. We had learned that lesson the hard way. Collins shifted, gripping his rifle tighter. "I hear him," he murmured. "Crawling. In the dirt. Right under us." I wanted to tell him he was losing it. That the jungle was playing tricks on him. That exhaustion, hunger, and dehydration were turning his mind inside out. But then I heard it too. A whisper. A shuffle. A sound that didn't belong. And then the ground exploded. I didn't even have time to react before the air filled with splinters and dirt, the shockwaves slamming into my chest like a sledgehammer. My ears rang, drowning out the world in a high-pitched scream as my back hit the ground hard, the sky above flickering between the twisting palm fronds and the swirling haze of dust. The explosion had been close, too close, and the moment I tried to move, I felt the sharp sting of shrapnel tearing into my shoulder. It wasn't deep, but the heat of it, the raw, searing pain, told me that the metal was still in there, burning, a foreign body lodged inside me like a reminder that I was still alive, whether I wanted to be or not. Somewhere in the chaos, Collins had started firing, his rifle cracking again and again, the muzzle flashes illuminating the dark spaces between the trees. I rolled onto my stomach, gritting my teeth against the pain, reaching for my machine gun, my fingers fumbling with the slick metal. The jungle was alive now, the silence shattered by the familiar symphony of war, screams, gunfire, the distant boom of artillery. But it wasn't like before. This was closer. Too close. A shadow moved in the undergrowth, fast, deliberate. Then another. And another. The enemy wasn't charging in waves this time. They were crawling, slithering through the dirt like vipers, weaving through the fallen trees and shattered trunks, their bayonets gleaming under the fractured sunlight. They were patient. They had been waiting. I braced the stock of my gun against my shoulder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my finger curling around the trigger. The first burst sent a spray of rounds tearing through the undergrowth, shredding leaves, snapping branches, but I knew better than to think I had hit them. These weren't conscripts, fresh off a boat with nothing but a rifle and a prayer. These were the ones who had lived in these tunnels, who had watched us from the darkness, who had learned our rhythms, our weaknesses. Collins let out a strangled yell, half rage, half terror, and I turned just in time to see one of them leap from the shadows, blade glinting as it slashed downward. Collins barely got his arm up in time, the steel slicing deep into his forearm, blood spraying in an arc as he fired wildly with his free hand. The shots were desperate, uncontrolled, but they hit their mark. The enemy soldier jerked backward, his body twisting as he collapsed into the dirt. But before Collins could even catch his breath, there was another, and another. I fired again, the barrel of my gun heating up so fast I could feel it through my gloves, the spent casings raining down around me, their metallic clatter lost in the deafening chaos. The jungle was alive with movement now, figures darting between the trees, shadows blending with shadows, and for every one I cut down, two more seemed to take their place. The air was thick with smoke, with the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood, with the raw, suffocating heat of a battlefield that had no mercy, no humanity. Collins fell back against a tree, his chest heaving, his arm limp at his side, blood soaking through his tattered sleeve. His eyes met mine wide, searching, and in them, I saw the same thought that was clawing its way through my own skull. We weren't getting out of this. Not this time. And then, just like that, there was silence again. Not the silence of peace. The silence of waiting. The enemy was still out there. I could feel them. Watching. Measuring. Deciding whether to strike again or let the jungle finish the job for them. I stayed frozen, my finger hovering over the trigger, my breath shallow, my ears straining against the oppressive quiet. Somewhere to my left, Collins let out a shaky exhale, the sound barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. And then, from the darkness, I heard something else. Laughter. Low, guttural, and human. And suddenly, I wasn't sure anymore who the real enemy was. My breath caught in my throat, my grip tightening on the machine gun, the slick metal warm and reassuring beneath my fingers. That sound, it didn't belong here. It wasn't the frantic, high-pitched shriek of a man losing his grip on sanity, nor was it the dry, humorless chuckle of a soldier who had seen too much and stopped caring. This was something else. Something deeper. A sound that slithered through the air, curling around my ears, seeping into my bones like the heat that never relented. Collins shifted beside me, his breath ragged, uneven. I knew he had heard it too. I could feel it in the way his body tensed, in the way his fingers fumbled to reload his rifle, the way his eyes darted from shadow to shadow, searching, questioning. His face was slick with sweat, streaked with grime and blood, his pupils wide and dark. The jungle had gone still again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the silence of waiting, of enemies biding their time, measuring their next move. This was something heavier, something unnatural. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made your skin prickle and your instincts scream at you to run, to leave, to forget whatever it was that lurked just beyond the edge of your understanding. But there was nowhere to run. The laughter came again, closer this time. Not loud, not exaggerated. Just a low, knowing chuckle that sent ice crawling up my spine, despite the heat. I swallowed hard, shifting my weight, my gaze locked on the darkness between the trees. Then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight, barely more than a shadow among the tangled undergrowth. It wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My muscles coiled, my finger tightening on the trigger, the instinct to fire screaming through my veins. But something held me back. Something deep in my gut told me that if I shot, it wouldn't matter. That bullets wouldn't change whatever this was. Collins let out a shuddering breath. "You see it," he whispered, though he didn't need to ask. I nodded slowly, not daring to look away. The figure shifted, stepping forward, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His uniform was tattered, barely holding together, the fabric stiff with old blood and dirt. His skin was stretched thin over sharp bones, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, but wide. Too wide. A grin curled across his face, unnatural, as if it had been carved into his flesh and never allowed to fade. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Not at first. Then, in a voice that was almost familiar, he whispered, "Thirsty?" My blood turned to ice. Collins let out a strangled noise, his rifle shaking in his hands, his breath coming in short, rapid bursts. I didn't dare answer. I didn't dare move. The figure cocked its head slightly, its grin never wavering. "You're already dead," it it murmured. "You just haven't figured it out yet." Something inside me snapped. I raised my gun, my hand steady despite the way my pulse hammered against my skull, and pulled the trigger. The bullets tore through the jungle, splintering trees, ripping through vines, sending a shower of leaves and dirt into the air. But when the dust settled, the figure was gone. Only the echo of laughter remained. And in that moment, I wasn't sure if the real enemy was the one out there in the jungle, or the one crawling its way into my mind. Collins was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven bursts. His rifle trembled in his grip, the whites of his eyes too bright in the dark, like an animal caught in a snare. I wanted to say something, anything, but what could I possibly say? That I had seen it too, that I had heard the voice, felt the weight of that presence pressing down on my skull like a vice, that the jungle was twisting, warping into something else entirely, something worse than the war we had been fighting. No, he didn't need to hear that. He already knew. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant, erratic pops of gunfire somewhere far beyond our position. The battle was still raging out there somewhere, but here, we had crossed into something else. Something not written in any field manual. Collins let out a dry, humorless laugh, but cracked in his throat before it could fully form. His fingers dug into the dirt, his nails caked with blood and grime. "We need to get the hell out of here," he muttered, his voice barely more than a breath, as if saying it too loudly would make whatever we had seen come back. I swallowed hard, forcing my own voice to steady. Where? The word felt foreign in my mouth, meaningless. There was no out, no escape. The island was a tomb, and we had been digging our graves since the moment our boots hit the sand. Collins didn't answer. He just stared at me, his breath coming in shallow, wheezing gasps, his wounded arm hanging limply at his side. The blood had slowed, congealing into a thick, ugly crust along the torn fabric of his sleeve. He wasn't going to last much longer. None of us were. A rustling sound cut through the silence. Not far. Not the wind. I swung my machine gun toward the noise, my muscles locking into place, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Collins followed suit, his hands tightening around his rifle, his injured arm forgotten in the rising tide of panic. Something moved in the undergrowth. Not fast. Not like the Japanese soldiers we had fought before. Those shadows that flickered in and out of sight before striking with ruthless efficiency. No, this was something else. It was slow, purposeful, as if it wanted us to hear it. A voice low, raspy, so quiet I almost thought I had imagined it, slipped through the leaves. Still, thirsty. Collins made a sound, a strangled gasp, his rifle jerking in his hands. He was unraveling, fast. I could feel it radiating off of him, the raw panic eating its way through his resolve. Stop, I hissed, more to myself than to him. Just stop. I didn't know who I was talking to. The figure stepped into the clearing. No, not one figure. 3. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their uniforms the same tattered remnants of what had once been standard-issue Marine gear. But it wasn't just the filth and blood that made them look wrong. Their bodies were too thin, their skins stretched tight over their bones, their eyes sunken deep into dark sockets. And their grins, God, those grins, carved into their faces like they had been stitched there, stretched too wide, showing too many teeth. I knew them. I knew them. Martinez, Holloway, Greaves. Men I had fought beside. Men I had buried. Martinez had taken a round through the chest days ago. I had seen him go down, gasping like a fish out of water, his fingers clawing at his own throat as blood bubbled up from his lips. Holloway, he had been caught in an artillery blast. There hadn't even been enough of him left to bury. Greaves? He had wandered off to find water and never came back. And yet, they were standing right in front of me. My mouth was dry. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body refused to listen. Collins was shaking. "This isn't real," he whispered. But it was. Martinez took a step forward, his boots pressing into the dirt without a sound. His head tilted slightly, that awful grin never wavering. His voice came low, hollow, like something scraping against stone. "You left us." The words punched the air from my lungs. Holloway moved next, his arms hanging limply at his sides, the torn remnants of his uniform flapping against his skeletal frame. His voice was just as empty, just as broken. You forgot us. Greaves stepped closer, his hollow gaze locked onto mine. But we didn't forget you. Collins let out a choked scream and opened fire. The muzzle flash lit up the jungle in bursts of blinding orange, bullets tearing through the figures. Through them, through Martinez, through Holloway, through Greaves. But they didn't fall. They didn't flinch. They just stood there, their grins never fading, their empty eyes locked onto ours. And then, one by one, they laughed. Deep, ragged, raw. The jungle melted away. The war, the battle, everything. And in that moment, I finally understood. This wasn't Peleliu. Not anymore. This was something else. Something we were never meant to leave. Collins emptied his rifle, the spent casings clattering onto the ground, the muzzle smoking in the humid night air. The figures didn't fall. They didn't even react. They just stood there, watching, smiling, as if the bullets were nothing more than whispers in the wind. The laughter never stopped. It rolled through the trees, slithering between the roots and ferns, wrapping around my spine like a cold, dead hand. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, my lungs burning from the thick, stagnant air. My hands were shaking, not from fear. No, fear was something I understood, something I had carried with me since the first time I set foot on this island. This was something deeper, something primal. My body was rejecting what my eyes were seeing, what my ears were hearing, trying to convince me that none of this was real. But I knew better. The jungle had already taken so much from us, our friends, our sanity, our humanity. It had watched us die, watched us kill, watched us beg for water, for mercy, for something that never came. And now, it was playing with us, twisting what was left of our minds into something unrecognizable. Collins stumbled back, his empty rifle slipping from his hands, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. His breath was ragged, his chest heaving, his eyes darting around a clearing like a trapped animal searching for an escape that didn't exist. I could see the cracks forming in him, spreading like fractures in brittle glass. He wasn't built for this, not this. He had survived the war, but this was something worse. The figures stepped closer, their movements slow, deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. The air between us was heavy, thick with something unseen, something that pressed against my skin like an invisible weight. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything but stand there like a fool staring into the abyss. But I couldn't. My body refused to obey, my muscles locked in place, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might tear its way out of my chest. Martinez, or whatever was wearing his face, cocked his head slightly, his grin stretching just a little too wide. You never made it out, you know. His voice was wrong, too dry, too hollow, like wind whispering through dead trees. You're still here. You've always been here. I tried to swallow, but my throat was too dry. Shut up. The words came out barely above a breath, weak, useless, like trying to fight the tide with my bare hands. Holloway stepped forward next, his uniform hanging off his skeletal frame, the dark holes of his eyes locked onto me like a predator studying prey. How long has it been, Eric? He said my name like he had always known it, like he had whispered it in my ear 1,000 times before. Days? Weeks? Years? He chuckled, a low, rattling sound that made my stomach twist. You don't even know anymore, do you? I clenched my teeth, my jaw so tight it hurt. We buried you. The words were meant to sound strong, but they didn't. They wavered, cracked at the edges. Greaves let out a soft hum, tapping a bony finger against his temple. Did you? His grin never wavered. Or did you just think you did? Collins let out a strangled noise, his hands digging into his scalp, his fingers clawing at his own skin, like he was trying to rip something out of his skull. This isn't real. This isn't real. This isn't real. His voice was high, frantic, shaking apart at the seams. Martinez stepped even closer, close enough that I could see the dried blood crusted along his collar, the jagged tear in his chest where the bullet had gone through. His empty eyes locked onto mine, searching, knowing. You want to know the truth, Eric? His voice dropped to a whisper. You never left this island. The jungle closed in around us, the trees twisting, warping, the shadows stretching longer than they should have. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, like I was standing on the edge of something deep, something endless. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but my body was frozen, locked in place by something stronger than fear. Collins let out a ragged sob, his knees buckling beneath him, his hands gripping his skull like he was trying to hold himself together. I can't do this, I can't. His breath hitched, broke, shattered into 1,000 pieces. And then, without warning, he turned and bolted. He ran blindly into the trees, his form disappearing into the tangled undergrowth, his footsteps fading into the heavy, suffocating silence. I wanted to call out to him, to tell him to stop, to stay with me, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat had closed up, my breath locked inside my chest. Martinez turned his head slightly, listening to the sound of Collins crashing through the jungle. Then, slowly, almost lazily, he looked back at me. That one won't last long, he mused, his tone almost amused. They never do. The jungle was shifting now, the trees moving when they shouldn't, the ground tilting beneath my feet. I felt like I was standing at the edge of something vast, something that had been waiting for me all along. The figures stepped closer. I tried to move. I couldn't. The laughter rose again, swirling around me, pulling me under. And then, nothing. The darkness embraced me, thick and suffocating, like wet cloth pressed against my face. It was impossible to tell whether I was standing, or falling, or even remaining in my body. Time dissolved, crumbled like sand between my fingers. Then a sound. Not voices, not whispers. Something deeper, heavier. The pulse of the earth itself. I inhaled. I opened my eyes. The sun beat down on my face, merciless, burning. Yellow sand, blue sky, water roaring somewhere nearby. I knew this place. I lay on the beach where it all began. Bodies, scattered like broken puppets, burnt, distorted. The smell of decay, too familiar, too real. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking like a newborn. Where was I? When? Someone moved in the distance. I focused my gaze. A soldier. An American. His face was hidden by a helmet, but his figure was familiar. Too familiar. He came closer, and suddenly I understood. It was me. The me I had been on the day of the landing. My own gaze met mine. Younger, uncorrupted, not yet broken. He hadn't seen me. He was just walking past me, through me like a ghost. I turned around, and suddenly everything came together. I never left this island. Martinez, Holloway, Greaves. They didn't come back because they were killed. They were here, all this time, like me, like all of us. I wanted to scream, but my lips wouldn't open. The sun grew brighter, unbearably blinding. Then everything dissolved again, and only silence remained.